Hello, everybody. How are you? Sorry about a 30-second delay. I had a little bit of technical difficulty. I have a window right here, and the wonderful sun. We were hit with a major storm yesterday, tons and tons of snow. Thank goodness the sun is coming out, and it's shining right through the window, and it was just putting too much light on this side of my face. And of course, we just can't have that, right? This is big time studio, high, audio and visual representation of the Three Believe program. So let me get our secondary backup recorder system going, and I've got a good program for you today. I'm going to give you a little bit of science. Well, I always give you some science, right? But it's going to be great. If you read any of the emails I was introducing you to, I talked about what if there was a relationship? What if there was a correlation between some symptoms? And, well, it just happens to be that there are a lot of people, millions of people, that have these symptoms. So I thought it was a good idea to go into it. So we're going to go right into the program today. Thank you for coming. If you can hear or see me, I would appreciate if you would just send me a little text and let me know that I'm live, I'm here, I'm being heard, and that you're anxious and excited to hear me. So let me pull this document over my cheat sheet over to the right a little bit. You know, it's cool that, you know how they have it on TV where these high-tech guys will have multiple screens, where they'll have the whole wall, be a screen to their computer. Well, I'm one of those guys that likes to have multiple screens open at the same time. And so I have 3 screens, and sometimes they interfere with each other, and they kind of cross over each other. And so I have that happening. So I'm just resizing this so that I am, well, nothing's going to stop us. All right. So thank you. Sounds like I've got some sound out there that you're hearing me. Looks like all lights are action, ready, set, go. So thank you for coming, and let's go ahead and just get started. I'm going to start and launch the video presentation. And I talked in the emails. I talked about the what if those with cardiovascular disease, but had not been diagnosed with diabetes, are simply undiagnosed diabetics. What if, as if saying that those two things are related, they are correlated, they are, what causes them is the same thing. Hello, everybody. I'm Jason Whitney. We're here to talk about some medical misunderstandings. And each week we get together to uncover what science has discovered about the complexities of the human body. I guess we could be grateful that we're not trying to understand the complexities of the human mind. Oh man, now wouldn't that be an endless wormhole that would be going down, right? So we're just going to talk about the simple body, not the confusing mind. And I'm getting started. Welcome to the Three Believe Wellness program. I am a food scientist. Now, I've been specializing in chronic disease now for over a decade. We can use functional foods to overcome the growing epidemic of issues like obesity and blood pressure, and diabetes, cholesterol, and the list goes on, right? I've been doing that for going on 12 years, working with doctors and clinics around the country, helping them find a different way to have their patients overcome these kind of symptoms that are plaguing the country. These are the national statistics. It's not getting better. It's getting worse, sadly. And so as you think about in your mind, just 4 of them, being overweight, having high blood pressure, having high cholesterol, or diagnosed with diabetes, just those 4, and there's many, many more, 80% of the people you love, every 80% of the people you work with and that you even see walking down the street have at least one of these 4 issues. And that's why we're here, and that's why we're talking about it. Personal story, it happened to me. I was over 11 years ago, I was pushing the scale at 280 pounds, and I wasn't healthy. I had all those issues. I overcame it, doing the same things I'm talking to you about, did it in less than 12 weeks without exercise, not because I don't love it, not because I don't believe in it, just because I knew that most people, or too many people, just wouldn't exercise. And so I wanted to prove to them and to me that it can be done without having to do exercise. And by the way, exercise is a terrible, terrible tool to lose weight. It's a great tool for strengthening your body, strengthening your core, giving you mobility, increasing your flexibility. It's a great tool for de-stressing yourself. It's great for other things. It's not great for losing weight. And so I did it all through diet. Just a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not a doctor. I'm a food scientist. I formulate functional foods. I read doctors' reports. I read scientific studies and break them down, try to make them simple to understand. But I want you to understand that this is just information, and it should be used for informational purposes. Always consult your doctor when making a lifestyle change. And the examples I'm giving are examples from my life and from the people that I know, and not any claim of overcoming or curing any disease or ailment. Now that we have the legal thing taken care of, and the FDA won't be coming after me, already did that, right? Let's go in and then break this out as to what this means. So this was actually by a doctor, a PhD researcher. He said those with cardiovascular disease, but not diagnosed with diabetes, are simply undiagnosed, meaning they haven't been diagnosed yet. But if you have a cardiovascular disease, you have one of them, right? And in the email I sent you, how many things are related to cardiovascular disease? 47 different conditions are classified as a cardiovascular disease. So there's a lot of them, all right? And so people will ask me, how did you get into this? Or what was the motivation for researching cardiovascular disease? And it's a personal story. In truth, it was the result of a blood test. And there are several things in my blood test that were way out of whack from normal. One of them was something called a GGT enzyme. It's an enzyme that your liver will spit out when it's getting too fat, right? Your liver's getting too fat, fatty liver disease, one of the first symptoms of a chronic issue, and those levels were too high. And my serum of ferritin, a kind of iron loading in the blood, and my cholesterol was way too high. So I went to several doctors trying to get an answer to the meaning of these high values and why they were way out the norm. And I just didn't get answers. They said, well, that's you. Here, take some medication. Now, I had 3 kids at the time. I had a wife, I had a career, and life to live. So, I was interested in how these tests, these negative things were going to affect my life. And at the time, I was a financial research technologist in my corporate job. So I was trained to focus on cause and effect and the relationship and correlation of causation in the financial markets. All I did was I just applied my training to medical research. Reading, instead of financial reports, I read medical research and solving my own personal issue. I was understand the complex problem solving activity of algorithms in math and in financial markets and in trends. So it occurred to me, I had to go directly to the database in the mountains of clinical studies that therein lay the answer to my problem. Within a short time, I understood everything that my doctors apparently did not know. Now, it wasn't because I was smarter than they are. It simply is a matter that you can't know something that you haven't been exposed to or taught, right? You can't be expected to build a canoe if you have zero knowledge of what canoes are made out of, or how to build them, or how to make sure they don't sink, right? It just doesn't come to you because you're interested. Just because you have a high IQ doesn't mean that you all of a sudden know how to make a canoe. Now you can have problem solving, and I was taught in problem solving. So I focused those skills and that education on this metabolic syndrome thing. Now I could argue that it should be more properly called insulin resistant syndrome or cardiometabolic syndrome, because that's really a more accurate term to what it really is. But it essentially means that your levels of insulin are much too high, and because of this, your cells have grown resistant. They don't like listening to insulin anymore. To some degree, to some level, you don't start out just insulin resistant. It's not a light switch, it's a dimmer switch. And you're not absorbing and responding to insulin like you used to. Now, if you're advanced in this, you'll also have something called hyperinsulinemia, which simply means that because your cells aren't absorbing insulin, your pancreas just produces more insulin in an effort to lower your ever-increasing glucose levels. Remember, there's a dance going on. Glucose hits your bloodstream, insulin comes along, chaperones that glucose to your cells and says, hey, I'm knocking on the door, here's some glucose, take it in, because your cells can't take in glucose without insulin. So when all of a sudden your cells are insulin, not listening to the chaperone of the glucose saying, here's some more, that means it also is not accepting the glucose. And your pancreas only has one trick up its sleeve. It just secretes more insulin. And now you have high levels of glucose and you have high levels of insulin at the same time. So because of insulin resistance, you can and will have multiple of other chronic issues, all coming from this one thing, insulin resistance. An overworking pancreas, that's hyperinsulinemia. That's what that hyperinsulinemia, just hyper insulin, too much. Elevated glucose and insulin at the same time. That's where you have type 2 diabetes. So when you hear of someone having a type 2 diabetic diagnosis, you know in your head now, well, they got too much glucose and they got too much insulin floating around in their bloodstream at the same time. Now, from that condition comes obesity, overweight, fatty liver disease, a buildup of calcium in your heart. I want you to think about that. Just remember that term, a buildup of calcium in your heart. So now you have what is called cardiovascular issues. And the list goes on, 43 of them so far, right? All coming from one thing, insulin resistance. But is that the actual cause? Is there anything before insulin resistant? Is just all of a sudden insulin resistant? No. Too much insulin comes from only one place. Too much glucose, and that comes from one place. Too many carbs. That's really the cause. Too many carbohydrates causes too much glucose. Too much glucose causes too much insulin. Too much insulin causes insulin resistance. Insulin resistance causes cardiovascular disease. End of story. Okay. Now, some scholars will argue that hyperinsulinemia comes before insulin resistance, or vice versa. One comes before the other. But that debate really isn't the crux. Do we want to waste our time with that? Because both conditions are correlation issues. They're related to each other, meaning they are related to the true cause. Both are caused by too much insulin for far too long. But the key thing people need to know that when you have both insulin resistant and hyperinsulinemia, a crazy pancreas pumping up too much insulin together at the same time, that's where you're in a pathological state, which means that your physical condition, whatever it is caused by a disease. So a pathological state is just saying, I got symptoms. I'm feeling a certain way. That pathological state means that is caused by a disease. Okay? So when you hear your doctor talking about it, now you know what it really actually means and how it might be impacting your life. And it's not going to stop there. It's going to continue unless you stop doing what it is that caused whatever you got. Okay? So let me tell you what the next medical term is, called peripheral insulin resistance. Okay. Peripheral insulin resistance means, let's just call it PIR, primarily reflects on impaired, broken glucose uptake by skeletal muscle. Most of your and my glucose that we absorb is done mostly by our skeletal muscle, right? And which is the main place for the insulin stimulated glucose disposal. That's where everything's mostly dumped. This is confirmed in clinical studies. You can see the report right there. You can go there and just confirm it. All right. It's the main way your body gets rid of glucose in your bloodstream, right? That's the receiver of all that glucose. So that's where most of your insulin resistance is going to begin, right? If you start this very low carb diet, all of a sudden out of the blue, right? In the beginning, you could have peripheral insulin resistance. Stop. Does that mean that a low carb diet actually causes insulin resistance? Well, no, that's kind of silly because it's not long term. It doesn't last. But it does cause what's something called peripheral insulin resistance because your cell's job is to want to save the glucose because you're going on this crazy low carb diet thing and eat. And since you're eating very little glucose, and so in turn, your body wants to save the glucose for the brain because that guy's got to stay alive or everything else dies, right? So if you suddenly cut off your source of glucose, your body's going to save what it is having, or if you reduce your carbs, it's used to getting those carbs. The rest of your body's going to have to go without because your brain is number one. He butts in front of the line, right? Didn't mean to say he. I don't want to be sexist. She, the brain. Let's go that way. So other cells have to wait. So the brain cells and red blood cells, they've got to have glucose. In fact, that's why you could enter into peripheral insulin resistance. Let me tell you a story. Yesterday, we had let's call her Carrie. A woman came in. She's been on our program for a while. Like a lot of us, took a break during the holiday. She moved, some changes at work. Just life gets in the way sometimes. Kind of got out of her routine and was off the diet for a little while. Wanted to get back into it. Had a new year, start things off right. And she came in, and she's always very friendly, but she was a little, I don't know, she's just a little off. Not really super friendly. I was talking to her and telling her just things. And believe me, I'm used to the fact that a lot of people get tired of me talking about stuff that they may not be interested in. I think they should be interested in it because it's interesting to me, right? That means that everybody else should be interested in it. But she was just busy. She was shopping. We have kind of in our manufacturing plant, in the front, we have kind of a retail center where local people can come and pick up food items and the stuff we make. So she's shopping around in our little area, and I'm talking away, and you know how you can just kind of tell people aren't listening? She was that way, and she had kind of this a deer in the headlights look. Well, we're going along talking, and she interrupts me. She says, "I'm sorry, I don't mean to not be attentive. I'm just having such a hard time concentrating on what you said." "What did you just say?" And she said, and I said, "What's wrong?" She says, "Oh, I just started the keto diet again today, the 3 Believe diet, and I'm really having harder than before. I'm really having a hard time concentrating." So I said, "All right, don't worry. I got the fix for you." I went in the back, whipped her up a little drink, and came back out and gave it to her. And literally, I kept talking, and she interrupts and says, and I'm not exaggerating. A minute and a half, 2 minutes max later, she says, I didn't know if this was placebo effect, but I feel much better." Another 5 minutes later, she says, "I am completely cured of that symptom. That is amazing. My brain is back. I'm thinking." What I thought was amazing, she was interested in what I had to say. I mean, I should be giving that to everybody so everyone listens to me, right? But what I gave her were ketones. Because what was she experiencing? She was experiencing peripheral insulin resistance. Why? Because her body said, "You're not giving me any carbs, and you're not giving me very many carbs. And so the carbs I do have and the carbs I am making by my liver, I've got to save that for the brain. And I got to save that for your red blood cells." And so even then, your brain's not getting enough or what it's used to. And so your cognition, your concentration is going to be affected. And so what I did is I gave her a short little boost. It's kind of like what I did is I turned the hands of time into the future about a week. What that means is I gave her what her body would be giving her in a week's time from now in the measure of ketones. Her body will go and make the ketones enough that her brain needs, so she's thinking great, right? And all I did is just fast forward it. That's why you don't want to continue taking ketones after about a week when you first start the diet. Now, what she was experiencing, what some people call the keto flu, right? She wasn't feeling good. She was discombobulated. She was disoriented. She was lacking concentration. So that is a perfect example of peripheral insulin resistance. So your body can temporarily develop regional insulin resistance to stop your cells from absorbing the insulin, which means that it will absorb the glucose. It stops absorbing the glucose too. Okay. So that's why you may feel that way. Take a little bit of salt. If you have some ketones, take those. We will be providing some quality ketones, pharmaceutical grade ketones, very soon. That's what I gave her, so that you can have that as well. So it's simply a safety mechanism. Your body wants to keep the glucose and insulin in your bloodstream for the brain, right? And because the brain got to stay alive, it's got to be going. But even with a little bit, it can kind of suffer. Now, this temporary is not pathological, right? Because it's temporary. It's not long-term. For it to be pathological, it has to be a long-term condition. So stay on. If this happens to you or any of your friends, tell them stay on the low-carb diet. And your body will get the message and adapt to the low glucose, because that's getting used to the ketones being produced instead of the normal high glucose margin. If they don't have any BHB ketones available, then take the trace minerals, take the hydrate, take the salt. If they don't have our hydrate, just go to their salt table and just take some salt. That will help them greatly, right? But if you have insulin resistance concurrently with hyperinsulinemia, which Carrie did, or Colin or Carrie, the true metabolic syndrome, that is the pathological state that you need to stay away from, right? Because that's long term, and that will lower the quality of your life and shorten it, right? And that's what we're calling Carrie. That's what she had. Now, there's some news out there talking about how low carb ketogenic diets actually increase your insulin resistance. But as I just described, it's not the full picture. Yes, it can do it when you first start, but it's called peripheral. insulin resistance. It's only localized. It's in certain areas, and it's temporary, right? And it's kind of like this. You got to be careful with some of the news, right? So it's kind of like there's popular news out there about the weather. In some parts of the world, it's getting hotter than normal, warmer than it's been in decades. This is actually a real picture I found of the newscast that their computer went kind of scawampus. Look at the temperature in Crave Creek, 2,960 degrees. In Surprise, 1,350, all right? 1,270 degrees. Okay, obviously it's not that high, but you get the point. I think this is, where is this? Oh, Mesa. All right, so we're in Arizona. I've been to Arizona. It seems like it does get that hot. So there's these news reports right now about how it's hotter than it's been in decades. And so some people talk about how we're facing global warming crisis, right? And then at the same time, there are places in the world right now this is real, this is not a computer glitch, that they're recording colder than normal temperatures, colder than it's been in decades. They argue that that's proof that we're facing a global freeze, not global warming, when perhaps the best description of all is neither warming or cooling weather, right? Both have proof to their claim. Maybe it's just that we're having a global climate change. It's changing, right? And that's what you have to listen to. So when you're listening to reports that speak negatively, like the Julian Michaels report that just talked negatively, that's the workout gal from the Biggest Loser show, Julian Michaels, just came out and just slammed keto. Well, she was citing some reports, kind of like this peripheral insulin resistance, but wasn't telling the full story. And so you got to read the full story. That's one of the reasons why I'm here every week, to help you sort out the details and understand the true facts. So got to get the full story. So if you go low carb for a period of time, more than a few hours or a couple of days, you can develop peripheral and muscular insulin resistance. To keep the glucose spared, saved. Good thing, because if you didn't, you'd go into a coma and your brain would die. And this makes total and absolute sense. Your body, evolutionary, your body has to have this ability to deal with periods of time without carbs. And it's okay, that's fine. If you suddenly eat a lot of glucose after, or carbohydrates when you're in that state, your blood sugar level is going to shoot sky high because you're in a low insulin state. They're still not listening to insulin. The enzymes to deal with the fats have been created and maximized in your system, and is not really ready to suddenly take a bolus amount of carbohydrates. So you hear about the carb hangover, where a low carb person kind of like has a big carb meal. You can call that a bolus meal, like a whole pizza, and they feel terrible. And that's because their body gets a shock with a sudden influx of glucose after they've had little to none, right? Your body is coiled like a spring to save and spare and be careful with glucose. That's when the healthy state. When it's in an unhealthy state, it'll just go through glucose not efficiently, not sparingly, and that's where we start having these metabolic problems, right? So now that you ate this pizza, this massive bolus amount is flooding the bloodstream, and your glucose goes really high. You can feel pretty bad or even sick afterwards. So if you're on a keto diet and then you have carbs and you feel sickly, it's not the keto diet that caused you to feel sick. It's the fact that you ate too many carbs, right? And that's the net effect. It's the carbs that are making you feel ill, not the keto diet, right? So this is a good time to tell you, if you want to avoid this feeling, if you're on a low carb, or if you're starting a low carb diet and you haven't been on it for a while, ideally you should keep carb cheats to a minimum, all right? Certainly big cheats that means don't go and eat 300 or 400 grams. That's the average carbohydrate consumption of Americans. Did you know that? So don't go back and start eating that, because it's going to affect your physiology. So I got into this topic of insulin resistance, right? But I was really explaining how I started my whole career in this. I was focusing on insulin resistance. Insulin resistance relationship to cardiovascular disease. So let's ask this question. By the way, this is a picture of what 300 grams of carbs. Though that sweet potato up there, that's 1.5 actually. 1.5 sweet potato, 1.5 potato, 2 slices of whole wheat bread, some oatmeal. That other picture is quinoa, and then the big one is some granola. Okay, that can be eaten easily in a day. All right, and that's the average amount of carbs. It's not very much food, isn't? I mean, that's not going to fill you up a lot. Now we could do all this in one big gulp of soda pop, but that's how much 300 is. That's what it visually looks like. So what is the connection between insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease? Well, let's go to some experts. Let's not listen to me. There's a huge overlap between these two conditions. In fact, Dr. Joseph Kraft, sadly, he passed away at 95 years old, February 21st, year 2017, so not too long ago. And he did over 15,000 insulin tests on patients. Insulin test is a big deal. It's not like a finger prick. It's a lot of work. He did 15,000, more than any other researcher, on patients back in the 70s. In an interview before he died, he essentially said, my beginning quote, "Those with cardiovascular disease not diagnosed with diabetes are simply undiagnosed." That's where that quote came from. His research found that most heart disease was essentially diabetes and a diabetic dysfunction, and that type 2 diabetes is really insulin resistance syndrome. So essentially, Dr. Kraft was saying, from all the research, that most heart disease is essentially insulin resistance syndrome. And there are so many pathways by which, if you are in the pathological state of hyperinsulinemia or insulin resistance, you are already there. You already have cardiovascular disease, and you already have type 2 diabetes. And there's so many pathways that are detrimental to your vascular system. And it's absolutely clinically proven. This isn't a laughing matter. This should be taken seriously, all right? So when you have inflammation markers will be raised. Now, this is a technical term. I put in there what's called your TNF alpha, all right? Tumor TN alpha is an inflammational marker only caused by having insulin resistance, and the result is type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. It will be raised, and it will attack your system. This little critter right here goes in and causes major problems. It attacks the endothelium, which is the tissue that forms a layer of cells. It's only one layer thick, right? Lining various organs and cavities of the body, especially in the blood vessels and heart and lymphatic vessels, or in your system. Why this is important is because when you talk about plaque buildup, this is how it happens. This is the cells where plaque gets underneath. So your fat cells will be swollen, and the insulin signaling in your fat with the larger cells will no longer work so well. And that will feed to lower and lower proteins, and a protein hormone which is involved in the regulation of glucose levels, and that also affects being able to break down your fatty acids. So you're storing fat instead of burning the fat, right? So this is not speculation. This is actually how it happens. Your levels, why you become hungry is because your increased leptin will happen, and it's a precursor because or a precursor of everything that we're describing. So it's a whole range of hormonal imbalances simply because we're eating too many carbohydrates. And so you hear all this language about how we have to have more carbs. It's the primary fuel. It's not the primary fuel by healthy design. It is the primary fuel by popular design, because most Americans or most people in the world are using that as their fuel source. Not because it's the way it's supposed to be for a healthy body. It's the primary energy source because that's what we're using. Just like gasoline, or should I say fossil fuels, is the primary energy source. The only reason it's primary is because we're making so much of it. We haven't developed solar or nuclear powers, right? Doesn't mean that the fossil fuels are better just because it's the most popular. So what happens is when you eat a high carb meal, what it does is it affects the cholesterol. We're going to talk about LDL here in a minute and the bad rap that it has. So just so you understand how this happens, it enters into the endothelium cell, just on the inner lining of your blood vessels, right? And when the high glucose levels spike, that's in our normal world, in spite of, even if you're trying to eat healthy and eat those sweet potatoes and that quinoa, and you're going to the gym, all that will not undo what's this chemical mechanism, this cascading that's happening right here. It will damage your tissue. It's absolutely proven that it happens, even damaging your proteins that you're eating. Your health and needed LDL cholesterols turn rogue. We have to have LDL, but this process of high carbohydrate will turn your LDL cholesterol into a bad cholesterol. And that's how we get the buildup of plaque in your cells. That's how we get our strokes and our heart attacks. It's not because it was given to you by your grandma and grandpa. These are major driving forces towards other hormones that are going to raise your function, like things like called the GFI. That is an insulin-like growth factor. Now, we need that. It's good for building muscle tissue and bone and skin. But when you have too much insulin being produced by your pancreas, it also will grow things like cancer cells. It'll also grow this plaque that's in your arteries at a much faster rate because you're getting too much of it. It's good things that turn bad. All of this was researched by this brilliant man, this researcher called Professor Gerald Raven. He basically wrote the story of insulin resistance as being one primary drivers of chronic disease. He did this study in 2002 where they took several hundred middle-aged people. They just did it randomly, all right? And he did a steady state of glucose plasma. What that means is they were watching their glucose levels constantly, right? They weren't checking it every hour. They're hooked up and they were reading it every second, which is the ultimate insulin test. So what they do is they infuse glucose into these people. It was about 5.5 millimoles of glucose. They knew how much they were giving them. And then they infused insulin on the other side of the arm to keep the glucose controlled at a certain level. So they knew that the body was going to start absorbing the glucose. So they wanted to make sure that the amount of glucose in the bloodstream was the same at 5.5 all the time. So they just gave them however much glucose they needed to keep that at that level. So it's kind of like you're driving down the road and they want to keep your gas tank always at full. They don't want it at 3/4 full. They don't want it 7/8. They don't want it at half. They want it full all the time. So they are driving right alongside you as a tanker truck that's pumping gas into your gas tank. Now, if you go up a hill or down a hill, you speed up, you're going to burn more fuel, right? So they might have to pump a little bit more gas in to keep your tank full. That's what they were doing to these people. They were just using glucose instead of gasoline. Now, what the test showed is if your whole body is insulin resistant, you won't use very much glucose. Your body's going to spare it. And that so that means that they weren't giving them very much. But someone who is insulin sensitive, right? Your cells like insulin, they will be absorbing a lot of that glucose dramatically. And it was difficult for these researchers to keep the readings at the 5.5 level. So it was really very interesting of how much the body can absorb. It's a very exotic test with multiple drips necessary pumping into these people to keep at 5.5. Now, what does this prove? Okay, so what this proof is that the average person of this age was 61 years. So they just randomized, they took people from the group. The average age just happened to be 61, middle-aged people. But the interesting thing was that because he got this amazing measurement, an accurate measure of insulin resistance also came through. He saw that those that were the most insulin sensitive, those people, they had no insulin resistance, and that and it was less than a third of the entire group. Now, this was back in the 2002 when he did this. So this was almost 20 years ago when he did this. And then a third of the people were insulin resistant. But those people, a third of them were not insulin resistant. And that 1/3 had no disease whatsoever, no cardiovascular events, no heart problems, were not overweight. And they tracked them for the following 7 years and no one died, right? It was very unusual to see a 61-year-old that was clean. It was very small measure because most Americans are eating so many carbohydrates, right? So in that group, they also found that they had 12 people in that 7-year period of time that died directly because of insulin resistance. In that group, 17% had cardiovascular disease. All right, deaths. Not just had the disease, but 70% had died from those from cardiovascular disease. The rest had diabetes, severe hypertension. A couple of them had cancer. So he basically had demonstrated that it was dramatically and statistically significant that insulin resistance dominates the chronic disease world. Not just chronic heart disease, but general chronic disease, like the 43 that I sent you on the email or leading up to this web class. This measure of insulin resistance is more powerful than anything else. You've got to watch out for insulin. So the hazard risk of dying from a chronic disease because they had insulin resistance was in this group was 40 times greater than the rest of the group. He also proved that checking your LDL cholesterol had a 1.001% prediction of having any cardiovascular issue in the following 7 years. What does that mean? It's saying doctors right now that are checking your LDL and they're saying, oh, it's too high or oh, it's just great. It doesn't mean a thing. It's not a good indicator. It had a 1% correlation to the people that actually died from cardiovascular disease. It basically means it has zero impact. Why are we checking for it? Most doctors have been taught to look at the wrong numbers. It's not the level of the LDL. So I thought it was a beautiful little experiment that there are countless more that have been done since 2002, and they're all saying the same thing. But one that was so dramatically that most doctors haven't even read it, right? So there's the study right there. It's a great, great study. If you want to research it, you want to go back into it, there it is for you. I love this study. It just, it solves much of the mystery of what and where are we getting cardiovascular issue from. So is this controversial at all? I mean, did you pick up on what I said? Every time you go into the doctor's office and they do a blood test, they tell you your cholesterol levels, and most of you have LDL that's elevated. And then they tell you, well, let's put you on a statin to lower that LDL. What I'm telling you, this study's saying it doesn't mean a darn thing. You're taking the cardiovascular medication for the wrong reason. It does not, it's not an indication of raising your risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, does that mean that you should ignore your blood readings? Should you ignore the LDL? No. And so let me go into that. So let me tell you a test that you want to be running, what you want to be looking at. The truth is that the LDL was easy to measure way back in the 60s and 70s, right? Everything was easier in the 70s. Everybody knew how to dance and wear cool clothes, right? It was, but measuring insulin was hard. Measuring HDL was easy. HDL, cholesterol measurements, easy. Measuring insulin was very difficult and very expensive. So LDL and cholesterol was easy, and it got very popular. And they saw a correlation with heart disease, and heart disease was a big deal, still is, not a causation, mind you, but it was just related, it was correlated. In other words, it was related in the same way that yellow fingers, yellow stains on the fingers is related to heart disease because it's related to smoking. But nobody thought that wearing gloves when you smoked, and that would prevent you from getting yellow fingers, therefore it would prevent you from getting heart disease, right? No, that's crazy. But that's exactly the same comparison to LDL and cardiovascular disease. So now that you have this boogeyman of the high, LDL, and it was related, right? But it was not the cause. LDL partakes in the atherosclerosis process, but it is in no way the cause. So let me explain. Basically, LDL got the bad rap then, and still does, because drugs were found to lower LDL, and it became a massive business, a huge money maker. Go look up the big money-making drugs, the most popular drugs that are out there, and they're statins. And the whole world of doctors say, hey, we've got LDL, bad cholesterol, and it's the cause, and we can treat it. It's fantastic. Everybody's happy. Everyone's taking their medication, and pharmaceutical companies are making money. The doctors are feeling like they're helping their patients because that's what they're being told. And then insulin testing came along, and the technology since the 70s and 60s has gotten much, much more accurate, much easier to test, and much faster. Then some crazy scientist, like the Raven that I just told you about, comes along showing that through clinical papers and many other doctors that this insulin is much more important than the LDL. But the world wasn't interested because they thought that we have this whole thing handled because we have this little pill and it lowers LDL. So the question is, we got to ask, do we have this cholesterol thing completely wrong? No one wanted to say, hey, we're kind of wrong on cholesterol. And, when cholesterol increases, it's particularly because hyperinsulin drives up the cholesterol. So it's not even the cholesterol itself, it's more the insulin. That's extremely embarrassing to a lot of important and wealthy people and businesses. If I was them, I would ultimately be upset. So many enormous money-making business models will just crash. So no one's going to want to have to be any part of disrupting this business. These two crazy old physicians and researchers came along shouting into the void, and no one really wants to listen to them. That's the way it was when they started their research. The only reason their research is getting any attention today, when it was done 30 years ago, is because there are so many other studies that have been done since that show the same result, the same thing that Kraft and Raven were talking about. Back then, they thought they were kooks. Not to mention the fact that you look at the clinical data and the impact of taking anti-cholesterol medication has no measurable effect on reducing heart disease. Some studies actually show that the death rates of taking statins actually go up. Pretty crazy. So let me repeat that. There is not one single clinical data study that shows that taking an anti-cholesterol medication has measurable effect on reducing you getting heart disease. Now, I'm not telling you to stop taking your statins. If you are taking a statin and you're concerned about these studies from Raven and Dr. Kraft, then I suggest you talk to your doctor. Don't just stop. Talk to your doctor and say, what else can we do? What are other options? And if that doctor doesn't know, then ask him about going on a ketogenic diet. Talk to him about, why don't we go right to the source? The medication is supposed to lower the cholesterol, right? Even though cholesterol is needed and it's important, but it's supposed to lower the bad cholesterol. Why don't we just go to the source and lower whatever it is that's causing me to have high cholesterol? And it's not fat. The studies say it's insulin. Talk to your doctor about that. And if your doctor makes fun of you, poo-hoos your idea, you know what my suggestion is? Find a new doctor. Find the doctor that will. Because the studies are irrefutable, right? So here's the theory that's going on, right? Here's the cholesterol theory as it exists. LDL is a full, its mechanism is full of proteins on the outer shell and no electrical negative charge and no desalination, which means it's on its way to becoming a little oxidized. It's starting to lose its components one by one. The current theory, lipid theory, is that these native, let's call the uncorrupted LDL, that just when they're first made, we're going to call that native, right? Native, non-damaged LDLs, they're saying, is toxic, right? Even though that Mother Nature, God, whatever power you want to say, even though it's there in its original form, in the purest sense, it's toxic. They have the ability to get through the endothelium film. Remember going back to the artery, how plaque is built up? They have the ability to slip right through it. The single layer on the outside of your arterial wall can be entered by this LDL. Even though the fact that they've proven that the LDL molecule is too big, they can't get through it. It's physically impossible for it to do it unless it's modified, right? And it's true that if the LDL can get in there, it will get oxidized. What does oxidize mean? It goes rogue, it gets burned off, right? And becomes part of atherosclerosis. That's the theory. And if you have more LDL particles in your bloodstream, you'll probably have more plaque in the wall. / if you're eating a high carb diet. More will be caught and oxidized and set off inflammation, cascade, and cause other problems. And it is as simple as that, right? The LDL is the bad boy and must be stopped. That's the prevailing theory. Now, another theory, another school of thought is that, which is getting a lot more evidence from crazy people like Professor Raven and Dr. Kraft, is that normal LDL, native LDL, does not really cause any of those problems at all. It is involved, but not the cause. It can, in fact, go through the wall if it's altered, and it can go into the endothelium, but it does not really cause the vast majority of heart disease. The idea is that the vast majority of heart disease is caused by modified LDL. The people in the first theory do agree that they see these modified LDLs. You can look at them and tell the difference. It's not just it's not just hypothesis saying, well, we believe that there's this made up thing called modified LDL. They really do exist. They can see them in the microscope. So these modified or damaged LDL in people that have heart disease, other scientists see that they're there, and they see that they're at 50 times higher level. But they say it doesn't matter because they are classifying them, all the LDLs, the same. And they say that they oxidize the same and that it doesn't matter all the time. And as if they caught a bank robber with a baseball hat and a cowboy boot, and that's being the cause of all bank robberies. In other words, all people with cowboy hats and boots are bad. All of them are bank robbers. That's the logic that this is following. But recent studies are clearly showing that there are two different types, two different classes of LDLs. Basically, it's a zombie LDL. One study showed that they took people who had chronic issues, patients who had already had bad cholesterol ratios. They took their blood out and they fractionated it into what is called now a type 1, type 2, type 3. And they are native or healthy LDLs. Then they found in these people already existing a type 4 and a type 5, which are mildly oxidized, all right? The oxidized, minimally oxidized in this case, in this test, found that the healthy people had zero type 4 or type 5. So healthy people with no cardiovascular symptoms had zero LDL type 4 and type 5 modified LDLs. Like I said a minute ago, and the unhealthy people had tons of type 4 and type 5. So they took the type 1, 2, and 3, the healthy types, from both the healthy and the unhealthy groups, and it did not cause, they exposed it to the endothelial tissues. So they took the healthy 1, 2, and 3 type LDL, and they exposed it to the endothelial cells. Guess what happened? Zero plaque was formed. None at all. Not even a little bit. Then they saw that they did the same thing with the type 5 or in 4s, and they found that the cells, the endothelial cells, formed plaque and they died. Right? So they did see that these 4 and 5s were only mildly oxidized, not massively like you might think. So mildly oxidized, even though they're a little bit oxidized, they still killed 45% of the endothelial cells in the culture. So now they said, wow, this minimally modified, not very much a zombie, LDL is a big deal. It's not like people have been saying, not like previous pharmaceutical companies have been saying. It's only minimally damaged, and yet it still has massive death rate, killing the cells. This is a huge issue. This could be the primary cause of atherosclerosis. And so they got LDL and oxidized with copper. So what happens, they took the LDL, and if you expose it to copper, it massively creates oxidation, right? So they're not mild anymore. They're massive oxidized LDL. And they looked at these new zombie copper LDL that killed 45% of the cells to see what making it oxidize and why it turned so deadly. And can you guess what it was? So they tried to they matched it. What was it that made them oxidize? And they found that it was hyperglycemia in the blood. What is that in plain language? What is hyperglycemia in the blood? It's glucose. Okay, it's from carbs. It's the French fries and the potatoes and the regular muffins and the candies and the chocolates. They found that too much insulin and too much carb for an extended period of time was to blame. That's what's turning the LDL molecules into zombies and causing plaque in your blood. So what does this mean? It means that eating sugar and carbs will create insulin. We know that. And this combo will cause the LDL to change and modify into an oxidized LDL, a damaged LDL, and be able to enter your cellular wall to cause plaque buildup. That's what we know now. That's what has been proven. So this is the cause of heart disease. But the popular pharmaceutical funded orthodoxy would say, no, don't look over there at that slightly modified LDL. Look at all of the LDL, because we have medication that will make it go lower. All right. And the other really, really interesting thing, interesting mechanism is called the glycocalyx. Now, I know we're a little bit going over, but you've never heard of glycocalyx, and you need to hear about them. So I'm going to be as quick as possible. Glycocalyx has been studied a lot by this Dr. Malcolm Kendrick. These are these glycocalyx hairs on the inside of your arterial wall. So your cell will have these little tiny hairs. Those hairs are called glycocalyx. Okay, it's kind of like Mother Nature's Teflon nonstick coating. These glycocalyx hairs, they're kind of they're a type of amino acid that rides on the outside of glucose molecules. Right, not the kind that you eat. It's the kind that already in your body. Right, after they've been broken down. Now these hairs are really, really small, only 200 nanometers long. And the reason it was only discovered about 30 years ago is when they started pushing medication to fight cholesterol. It's because as soon as you take out these cells out of a living organism, the glycocalyx hairs disappears almost immediately. And they discovered it with a electron microscope. And you can see these little tiny fellows. And they discovered that what these hairs do. Depending on the flow and the share of the blood, they'll trigger an endothelium lining to release nitrous oxide and many other components. Now that's cool, because you've also in other studies seen that nitrous oxide can help break down plaque buildup. Okay, isn't that fascinating? And that's what these glycocalyx do naturally without you taking nitrous oxide supplementation. The hairs also filter platelets and LDL particles, right? So the glycocalyx hold these and manage them and allow them to interface with the endothelium to keep them away, depending on if they're oxidized or not. So these hairs on the outside are keeping a distance between the endothelium film so that they can't get in there to make plaque. So that's what those hairs do. That's why you don't get plaque if your and your glycocalyx are working right. It's an amazing, magical function. I believe in God, and so wow, thank you, Creator, for doing this, for just being so smart. But this is a long, short story. You can kill off these little hairs that literally save your life by getting sugar and too much insulin in your bloodstream. You've heard of a C-reactive protein. It's an inflammational factor. It's a marker helping in causing insulin resistance and diabetes and obesity. You don't want your C-reactive protein to be too high, all right? So what happens is your C-reactive programs is a signal that your glycocalyx are dying off, that they're disappearing. So if you have high C-reactive protein, you know that these little glycocalyx are dying or dead. Okay? They found that when they transplant, this is fascinating, when they transplant an artery from a cadaver, what's a cadaver? It's dead, okay? Or any other artery in your own body, these hairs don't exist, and the glycocalyx don't exist, because remember, they die off as soon if the organism isn't alive. But they'll grow back if you don't flood your body with glucose. That was interesting, because what they were doing is they were doing these transplants, on heart patients, and then they would give them high carb diets in the hospital, right? And then they would see that almost immediately that these brand new transplanted arteries that had no plaque in them were growing plaque. Just all of a sudden, they're like, what? They're in the hospital. We're giving them hospital food. We just had the surgery. We know that the artery didn't have any plaque buildup, and they're growing plaque, and we're not giving them any fat. No, it's because fat doesn't cause it, right? So it's because of the rogue LDLs, right? And they found that without these glycocalyx, 10 to 20 times more zombie LDL cells get into the endothelium film or cells. So without them, they're there. Just a point of note, how long does it take to grow your hairs back, your endothelium hairs back? It takes about 8 to 12 hours, right? Which is great if you had a really bad haircut and that's how long it took for you to grow it back out, right? But it's way too long for your normal eating cycle, because if it takes 8 to 12 hours to grow hairs back after a high carb meal, most people are eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, not to mention snacks in between, sooner than 8 or 12 hours. So there's definitive, absolute proof that eating our sugars and carbs are not doing us any good. They kill off these glycocalyx. They cause our LDL cholesterol to turn rogue, to turn bad, and that's what's causing cardiovascular disease. So I apologize for going a little bit over. Hopefully this is informational. Hopefully that you got some good news out of it. Every week we'll bring back some new cutting edge science on the 3 Believe Wellness program. I appreciate you here. Love that you're coming by. And I'll be here next week with more tips of how to, well, make your life a little bit better. See you later.